It was interesting, sort of getting ready for Sunday, considering it was problematic passages. Um, which this is the first week where we're kind of getting into these passages that are troubling or disturbing or confusing or in some way morally questionable at least. Um, and hopefully you can see my face. Usually you do side by side with a speaker up in your little options there. You should see me right next to the presentation. So hopefully you've got that going. But that's under the view up in the upper right hand corner. There's a little view button. You can click side by side with speaker, and hopefully you'll see me speaking as much as you'll see the picture. So anyway, these are passages that makes us kind of ask, is that in the Bible? Or, that's hard to believe. Today, we have the story of the Nephilim. This story that sort of precedes the story of Noah. We're in between the Tower of Babel and Noah. And I wanted, this came up because someone said, what are these Nephilim? Could we include this in problematic passages? And so I thought, okay, let's do that. But second, because it's kind of a short story, it's not too complicated, and it allows us to kind of revisit the question of how do we interpret the Bible. Because the main question here, and anytime we read the Bible or watch a TV show or listen to the news or communicate in any way to anyone, we are interpreting what we're hearing, what we're seeing. And I want to spend a little time going back over, an admittedly kind of simple process that I'm using to approach these passages. To start, though, I need to, put up a word that is not a curse word, but it is a word that's cursed. Because hopefully it'll be the last time that this will come up. I don't think you'll hear this word. Except maybe today and probably just at the beginning. But when it comes to interpretation, I won't be using this curse word at all. I almost don't even want to say it out loud because I feel like I'll be conjuring it from thin air. Because we're not going to be using that as a frame at all. I don't think it's really helpful. Part of the problem is we already can't help interpreting things this way because it's how we kind of interpret everything. We live in a very literal culture. We prefer prose to poetry. We prefer, modern fantasy and science fiction to epics. We watch movies where we feel it's very important that everyone, mirrors in real life in some way the character that they're portraying. But the Bible wasn't written by modern people. They preferred poetry to prose. They preferred epics. They weren't concerned about the interior personal lives of people. There was actually a very early group, early Christian group that read the Bible in a literal way. They're called the Manichaeans. And they were sort of a Christian group who rejected the Hebrew Bible because they read the New Testament. They said, oh, here's Jesus preaching love and compassion. But the God in the Hebrew Bible is so jealous and angry and just kind of generally insecure, and so they tossed it out because they read it very literally. But the rest of the Christian world, and the formation of rabbinical Judaism that happened around the same time, didn't do that because they read these holy books in a different way. They used a different interpretive framework. So to get us there, I'm going to use something closer to their process. And hopefully this looks familiar from last year when we kind of went over this before. These sort of three steps in the reading process: the diegetic, what is meaning, and what is significance. And I'm using these words in a little bit of a technical way, a little distinctly, and don't go say, well, my pastor said this is what meaning means, and this is what significant means. I mean, those are kind of synonyms. So I'm kind of doing this to peel things apart a little bit. But diegetic, if you remember, just means what is there in the story. It's describing as closely as possible exactly what happens, summarizing, right, what's going on without trying to interpret anything, but simply describing what is happening in the text itself. And this is an old term, but it's used a lot in the movie industry. So there is diegetic music and non-diegetic music. What is diegetic music? Well, If you've ever watched The Birds, there's no music in that movie at all. The whole movie has no music until Tippi Hedren sits down at one point and plays the piano. That's diegetic music. Okay? She hears it, the characters hear it. It happens in the story of the movie. To contrast that, you have something like Indiana Jones, right? Indiana Jones, he takes his whip out, he slings it on a pole, he swings across and jumps on an airplane or something. You hear dun 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 dun, right? You hear the hero music, right? Indiana Jones doesn't hear that music. We hear the music, but the music isn't in the movie, isn't part of the movie, right? So that's non-diegetic music. It's not music that's in the movie as a part of the movie. It's a part of the movie that we experience, but the characters in the movie don't experience. So non-diegetic music versus diegetic music, where Tippi Hedren sits down and plays the piano in the middle of the movie. Okay, so that's just a kind of simple way of trying to understand what I mean by diegetic. So the Nephilim story, how to summarize it. Humans start to multiply. They have daughters with the sons of God, which the sons of God find attractive, and the sons of God have children with these daughters of earth, right? God limits the life of humans 120 years because they are flesh, and God's spirit will not be with them forever. The Nephilim, heroes of old, mighty warriors, were on the earth at this time. God sees that humans are doing evil, decides to destroy them, but Noah finds favor with God. Okay, so that's a summary of the passage that Ben read. Okay, now maybe quibble with a couple details. I think that's pretty good. Okay, so that's diegetically what we have going on in the story. The next thing is meaning, and meaning, for this exercise is primarily like what you might do in an academic setting. Like you're taking a look at this, you're trying to understand the context, the history of the text, understand sort of what the authorial intent is, what the editors might be trying to convey, what the people who would have read this story or heard this story would have taken from it, right? And that gets really complicated when you get a very old story like this one. Might entail the cultural life of a people at different points in their history, written down at a different time, edited multiple times. The story of the Nephilim, it appears in that first 11 chapters of Genesis, which are just sort of these fantastical stories that in a sense happen in a time outside of time, a time outside of history. Everything there is set a long time ago in a land far, far away. From Adam and Eve and the Tower of Babel and the story of Noah, right? So this story of the Nephilim is probably really, really old. It's probably older even than Abraham. It is probably entered into this collection of oral stories that are told and retold in this first, what we consider this first section of Genesis, influenced by other cultures. Maybe they became a part of the Hebrew, history around 1200 BC. At the earliest, they were written around 1000 BC. They were changed and edited. The final form we have them probably took place around 600, 500 BC, maybe a little bit later. There are all these sort of edits and changes, and we can kind of detect some of these things. It's very complicated. There are all these sort of different layers of the history of the text. And so we have these kind of layers of meaning. Like, what does the story kind of mean in its literary form? Right? What might be its historical context? And at what time? And what is the history of the text itself? When did it go from something that was oral to something that was written down? When was it last edited? When was it redacted? By whom? By which different people? What were the different influences? What is a theological background? What is it trying to say? And these are kind of just a few of the things you might look at, right? So I don't know if you ever watched those baking shows and someone makes an opera cake. It's one of those cakes that has like 20 really thin layers on it. That's kind of what some of these stories are like, to kind of delve into, right? And so even the question, which I know a lot of you are asking, did this really happen? Like in the sense of, we know the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th, 1776, right? Did this really happen? Probably not. Did the people who recorded this story believe that it happened? Maybe. Which ones? The authors, the editors, the compilers, at which time? This kind of thing gets really, really complex when you start digging into this, right? For the story itself, Nephilim, it's an interesting word. It appears later in Deuteronomy when they enter the land and there are giants there, or mighty warriors might be closer in Canaan. Joshua brings that report. It appears in Ezekiel. The word itself is connected with the idea of fallen or the fallen one. That's what the Hebrew refers to. But in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it's translated as warrior, hero, these kind of big, aggressive type people. Much later in the book of Enoch and Jubilees, which are written around 200 to 100 BC, in Enoch and Jubilees, the sons of heaven or sons of God are considered fallen angels, right? Which come down and sleep with human women and give offspring to these demi-humans, these sort of mighty Nephilim, right? And that's probably the story that a lot of you have heard when it comes to the Nephilim. It's the story that we find in the book of Enoch and Jubilees. And you're probably wondering to yourself, what is the book of Enoch and Jubilees? Are they in the Bible? Does it matter? Some strains of Orthodox churches and even Catholicism, even some sections of Judaism, include the book of Jubilees and the book of Enoch in their Bible. But what does it mean to be in the Bible? Right? So for a lot of us, since the early modern period, especially since the Reformation, we think of the books of the Bible as a sort of canonical scripture from which we are to divine the meaning of God's revelation, as if they're kind of oracular. But that's not really how the Bible was formed or how it was thought of before then, right? You have to remember, people didn't have copies of the Bible laying around. These were very expensive, very precious. They're typically maybe owned by a community. They're very rarely complete in the sense that we think of them as complete. Maybe some people had papyrus copies. But in general, it's important to remember people didn't read the Bible. They didn't have books. They heard the Bible read. It's far more accurate to think of the books of the Bible as the group of books from which Christians read at their Sunday gatherings. And that's really the long and the short of it. Some other texts might have been included with their scriptures. They might have even been familiar to them, but they wouldn't have read from them on Sunday mornings, right? They had the writings of the Jews, including sometimes Enoch, Tobit, Maccabees, these other books of the Bible you may have heard of. But they always included the writings of the apostles, which may or may not have included some of the ones we have now, plus a few more, like the Shepherd of Hermas. They might not have had Revelation or Jude. There's no organization to this. There's no institution that's making statements and putting out guidelines. This doesn't happen until a few hundred years later, until they get kind of a more cohesive group. But even then, it's not really settled and set. It's always been kind of up for grabs, right? But the thing to remember is that what makes them distinctive was that these are the books that you read from on Sunday morning. These are the books that are read within the community when they are assembled, right? So when we come to this meaning about the sons of heaven or sons of God or great warriors or these demi-humans, these offspring, are they angels, demons, giants, monsters? All I can tell you is this: nobody really knows. There's a reason that there are so many stories that are sort of spun out of this passage, because they're vague and ambiguous and mysterious. I don't know if you read The Lord of the Rings, but there's always, this point where they, Gandalf talks, has this sort of little thing that he talks about. They run across an old statue or they see a ruined fort. And Gandalf talks vaguely about some ancient time of great heroes or some big war battle or happened there. And, if you're a super nerd, you go to the index at the back of the book and see if you can find what he's talking about. Or maybe you go to the Silmarillion, to find out who like Beren and Luthien were, right? You nerds know what I'm talking about. So that's kind of like the vibe that you get from this, right? So what does it mean? In this context, I think it's safe to say, the kind of the long and the short of it is, I think it's significant that this story immediately precedes the flood. And the shortening of human life from 600 or 700 years, which happens in the genealogies leading up to Noah, to just 120 years, right? It represents a kind of decline after the Tower of Babel and leading into the flood. There's this violation of divine and human boundaries. There's this downward slide into corruption and violence, right? The evil, men just do evil all the time, and that's what's in their heart. And it leads the story of Noah, and which is actually kind of a rescue story where all of humanity is saved, or humanity is saved from complete destruction. And I think there's a good reason to follow this line of thinking, because I don't know if you've ever noticed this or not, but can you think of any superheroes in the Bible? I mean, there are a lot of superheroes in other cultures in their folk stories. I mean, you got Hercules, Romulus, Gilgamesh, Rostam, Finn McCool. I mean, they're all over the place. That doesn't even really count the gods. But when you look at the Bible, and I might have asked this if you were all here, if we were in person, get a response. There's really only one superhero in the Bible, Samson. And many of you probably know the story of Samson. But the thing to remember about Samson really is that he's a catastrophe. Mostly he just kills a bunch of Philistines at different times when he gets enraged. He doesn't really solve any of the problems. He eats unclean food. He is disrespectful to his parents. He falls for a Philistine girl. He's seduced by her into giving up his power. The secret is power. He's blinded. He's humiliated. At the end, his hair grows back. The story. And this sort of act of revenge, he knocks down the temple of Dagon and kills everybody inside of it, including himself. He doesn't help the Israelites much. Samson really only thinks of himself and uses his power for himself, and his hubris destroys him. He is the last judge at the end of the book of Judges, and the book of Judges, kind of like this story, is a part of this sort of continual, desperate downward spiral to chaos and madness. The tribes of Israel at the end of Judges are acting like Sodom and Gomorrah. And there's this dark, foreboding statement there. There was no king in the land. And that leads into 1st and 2nd Samuel, Samuel, who's the last judge, and ends up anointing Saul and then David. So when you think of the heroes of the Bible, the heroes of the Hebrew scriptures, Isaac and Jacob and Abraham, Samuel and David, Ruth and Esther, prophets like Isaiah and Elijah, some of them were great warriors, but they weren't superheroes. And if you remember the stories, especially the story about the brothers, you know that in these stories, it was often the younger and even the weaker brother who comes out on top. So I think it's fair to say that the meaning that resonates in this sort of short section, this mythical section of the Bible, it functions as a warning that there are these stories from ancient times of these great warriors, half human, half gods, superheroes. But as these stories are incorporated into the flow of this passage, they become harbingers of trouble, harbingers of disaster. They are foreboding figures, right? And I think that's what the meaning of this passage is and how it flows in the story. Now, I'll be honest, it's just a shot. As I said, there are a lot of very sort of vague, mysterious things in this section. It's very enticing. You're going to find reference to Nephilim all over the place, ancient esoterica, all the way up to modern Japanese animation, even modern fantasy and science fiction stories. But I think that's how this story functions in the flow of Genesis. So significance. And by significance, I mean, what is the significance for us, right? What does the church throughout time take from this? And we all here gathered together, even individually. And if you remember when I addressed this issue last time, last year, we talked about how there was two kind of equally valuable but different ways of doing interpretation. that I related to music. So the first is sort of classical music. You have the score, and the significance you derive, the interpretation you derive, happens sort of within the score itself. You know, there's stretches. You pick a tempo. You decide how loud or quickly you're going to play. You decide, you know, what things you're going to accent. But it's played within the structure of the score for the most part, right? And the beauty is found in that interpretation and in the musicality and the precision and the beauty of the music that's written. The other sort of form is jazz, which has a very much more vague connection to the music or to the song or the score. You know, you just have a chord sheet sometimes, maybe with the melody written out, and you're meant to improvise, not so much interpret, but improvise around that. Now, that's not exactly true if you know much about music, but it kind of gives a general sense of where you're going in how you're trying to interpret things. Now, these are both valid ways of interpreting, but we in our modern ideas tend to think is the classical music form is the only way to do it. We really have a lot of loyalty to the author. And for a lot of us, the meaning of something is its significance. They're basically virtually the same. Meaning is all about authorial intent and how the original audience, whatever that might mean, would have understood the author. But for interpreters of holy books, of holy texts within a sacred community, when it comes to significance, we may or may not stick with the author's meaning. In fact, the authors of the Bible would have been surprised at how much we limit ourselves to meaning. How much, and they would have thought of it as kind of impoverished, that we don't let our minds and our hearts and our spirits hear for a deeper spiritual meaning to a text. Because a spiritual meaning, an allegorical reading of the text, reading it otherwise, disconnects meaning and significance in a way that makes modern readers uncomfortable. But it's how Paul and John and Jesus, they did this all the time, consistently and with great ease. Matthew does it. I mean, we just did Christmas, so we all know this passage, right? Look, a virgin shall conceive, shall bear a son, and name him Emmanuel, right? We hear that phrase. This is quoted in the Gospel of Matthew, and who do we think it's talking about? Jesus. Problem is, it isn't talking about Jesus at all. Here's the text in full, or not in full, but mostly, from Isaiah chapter 9. Again, the Lord spoke to King Ahaz. Ahaz is a king, saying, ask a sign of the Lord your God, let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as the heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, I will not put the Lord to the test. Then Isaiah said, hear then, O David, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary mortals that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey by the time he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose two kings you are in dread will be deserted. So Ahaz is king down in Judah. The northern kingdoms, Aram and Ephraim, his kingdoms in the north, have formed an alliance, and they've attacked the land of Judah, but they've been defeated, but they're all still terrified. They're really scared of these kings. So Isaiah is sent by God to King Ahaz, the king of the Judeans, and to comfort them and says, look, you're going to be okay. Ask for me a sign to show that this promise is true. Ahaz refuses, which irritates God and irritates Isaiah. So he says, God will give a sign. And there's a young woman in court. He kind of points to her and says, look, you see that woman over there who's pregnant? She's going to have a son. She's going to name him Emmanuel. By the time he's weaned and is able to refuse the evil and choose the good, like by the time he's kind of like toddlerish, those kings that you're afraid of and all of their land are going to be destroyed. Right? That's the context of that, what Isaiah is saying to King Ahaz. And Matthew takes that story about a young girl who's pregnant, who's about to give birth, and God's promise that by the time that child, is about a toddler or is weaned, those kings are going to be destroyed. He rips that out of its context. At least that's what we would say today. Right? And he applies it to Jesus. But that is how the people who wrote the Bible interpreted the Bible. They listened for the Spirit and how the Spirit was speaking in the text to the people. It was the Spirit of Torah if you were Jewish, the Spirit of Christ if you were a Christian. And that allegorical reading, that spiritual reading, was shared into community and held in community, so that there were many true interpretations of any passage. Like these ancient stories and the ancient words of the prophets, and even the words of Jesus and the words of the apostles, they were like this sort of bell that was rung thousands of years ago that resonates into the present moment. And that sound that Matthew hears, right? He hears this resonance, this harmony of Christ in this ancient promise of salvation and a child who is born to a young woman whose name is given as God is with us. Jesus is not in that story diegetically. He's not even there in its meaning. But in the significance, he is there. There is this accord, this harmony with the scriptures that Matthew hears. So that's what it means to read these texts allegorically, what it means to read these texts, to look for a deeper spiritual meaning. Now, when it comes to the Nephilim, we may not need to go quite as far afield as Matthew and Paul sometimes do, because I think we already hear in the teachings of Jesus the subversion of power, the danger of power, and the undercutting of this idea of strength and mightiness. We certainly hear it in the story of Jesus. Just this past week, with a Bible study, we read this passage. It's actually part of a larger passage in 1 Corinthians that describes what God is doing in Jesus and the cross is foolishness and weakness to the world, right? This Jesus who comes and he's arrested by the local governor and is executed like a criminal, right? But for us, it's showing us the way of salvation, of holiness, of righteousness, of liberation. That the weakness of God is more powerful than the strength of humanity. That Christ has revealed that the truth about the world and God is not to be found in might and power, but in humility, compassion, love, peace, community. If there's one thing that's the same between our world and the ancient world, it's how much we love our heroes, symbols, defenders of justice and freedom. I think of, Captain America. That's a good-looking man right there, right? Captain Marvel. Look how glittery and glowy she is. Superman and Wonder Woman, how strong and good-looking they are. Hercules from the ancient world and Penelope, Freya and Thor, their beauty, their strength, their shining example for us to follow. So much beautiful poetry and songs and stories are wrapped up with these figures. This is like an encounter with a divine presence in human form. Or think even of the, experiencing the divine presence in maybe a much less human form. We can experience in the warmth of a sun. And we think of the life-giving rain. We think of the fertile earth, the ancient tree, the great ocean. But gathered around this table, we also see most powerfully the divinity of a dusty migrant peasant who was arrested and executed by the local authorities. We are compelled by the Spirit that we must hold that as the core of the revelation of the divine in the world. And because of that story, because of our understanding, our experience of Jesus, we can see divinity everywhere. In the dirty and the filthy, in the criminal and the vagrant, in whoever and wherever we think is most distant from the divine touch, even in its very opposite. The story of Jesus speaks to us from the cross. And that there is therefore now nowhere where God is not. not in humiliation, not in destitution, not in failure, not even in death. Because God is everywhere, because all things are within God, there is real hope. There is a new vision for life, not just for superheroes, but people like me and people like you. Amen.